The morning Earl Dunbar took my land, he shook my hand first. That is the part I still think about 10 years later. He looked me in the eye on my own front porch in the November cold, and he shook my hand, and he said he was sorry it had come to this. Then he handed me a document that transferred ownership of 412 acres of Wyoming land that had been in my family for 3 generations to a holding company with his wife's maiden name on it. And he drove away in a clean truck down a road my grandfather had built. I was 34 years old. I had $40 in my wallet and a cracked rib from an incident 2 nights before that I will tell you about shortly. I stood on that porch in the cold, and I watched his taillights disappear, and I made myself one promise. Not out loud, just inside the part of me that was built from the same material as that land. I am coming back for this. It took me 10 years. What happened the morning I rode back onto that property is something Earl Dunbar did not see coming, because he had made the same mistake that men like him always make. He assumed that a man with nothing had nothing left to fight with. He was wrong. Drop your country in the comments right now. I read every single one. And if this story is already in your chest tap, like it keeps this channel alive, let me take you all the way back to where this started. My name is Hank Collier. I grew up on that Wyoming land the way some people grow up in a house. The land was the house. 412 acres of high plains, grass, and creek bottom and ridge line that my grandfather Walter Collier homesteaded in 1951 when he came back from Korea. With a bad knee and a government land grant and the specific stubbornness of a man who has survived something that should have killed him, my father expanded it, added the south pasture in 1978, put in the irrigation system himself over 3 summers, built the barn that still stands on the northeast corner with lumber he milled from trees he felled himself. Grew up in that barn more than I grew up in the house. I could tell you the smell of it in every season. Hay and horses in summer, cold metal and frozen ground in January, the particular warmth of animals in winter that makes you understand why people built their homes next to their livestock for 10,000 years. I took over the operation when my father's heart gave out in 2009. I was 27 years old. I was not ready, but the land did not care about ready. It just needed someone to show up, and I showed up. For 4 years I ran it alone. Not well. Not profitably, but honestly. Every debt was mine. Every decision was mine. Every bad season and every good one. Mine. Earl Dunbar came into my life through a bank. That is the cleanest way to say it. He was what they call a private agricultural lender, which means he was a man with capital who identified struggling ranch operations and offered them financing that the conventional banks would not touch. His rates were not predatory on paper. He was too careful for that. The terms looked reasonable if you read them the way he intended you to read them and not the way they were actually written. I was behind on 2 notes in the fall of 2013, not catastrophically, about $11,000 behind on a property that was worth considerably more than that. I needed a bridge. Something to get through the winter and into the spring calving season when the cash flow would improve. Earl offered me exactly that. A bridge loan at terms I thought I understood. I signed. That was the beginning of the end of the first chapter of my life. What Earl had written into that contract in language that required a specific kind of legal training to parse was a default acceleration clause. It's tied not to my payment schedule, but to the assessed value of the property relative to the outstanding balance. If the county reassessed the land value downward by more than 15%, for any reason including drought designation or agricultural reclassification, he could call the entire note immediately. The winter of 2013 to 2014 was the driest on record in that part of Wyoming. The county issued a drought emergency designation in February. Earl filed the acceleration notice in March. I had 30 days to produce the full balance, which was $63,000, which I did not have and had no way of getting in 30 days. I hired an attorney in Cheyenne. She looked at the contract for 2 days, and then she called me and said, "Hank, I am going to be honest with you. This was written by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. This was not a mistake. A plan. Earl Dunbar had done this before. Not to me specifically. 2-3 other ranch operations in a 2-county radius over the previous 8 years. He would identify a struggling property with a strong underlying land value offer, a bridge loan with the acceleration clause, buried in the language wait for, a weather event or a market shift that triggered the clause and called the note when the owner had no possible way to respond. Then he would take the property through the default process at a fraction of its value and either hold it or sell it to development interests. He was not a lender. He was a predator with a law degree and a lot of patience. I tried everything. I called every bank within 100 miles. I called the USDA Farm Service office. I called my father's old business contacts. I called people I had not spoken to in years and asked for things I had never asked anyone for in my life. Nothing came through fast enough. On the last day of the notice period, Earl came to the property personally. 2 men with him. He stood on my porch and he handed me the transfer documents and he shook my hand and he said those words. I'm sorry. It came to this. I signed because I had no choice that day. But I want to tell you what happened 2 nights before he came to the porch because I told you about the cracked rib and I owe you the full story. The night before the deadline, I drove to Earl's office in town. I was not going to threaten him. I was not going to do anything that would give him a legal weapon to use against me. I just wanted to look at him and tell him that I knew what he was, that I understood what he had done was deliberate, that I was going to remember it. 2 of the men who worked for him were in the parking lot when I arrived. I do not know if he sent them or if it was coincidence. I believe it was not coincidence. There was a confrontation. I will leave the specific details in the general category. Of 2 against 1 in a gravel parking lot at 9 at night. I drove myself to the urgent care in Torrington with what turned out to be 1 cracked rib and a cut above my left eye that needed 4 stitches. I told the nurse I had fallen. She had the face of a woman who had heard that before. The next morning, Earl came to the porch. And the morning after that, I drove away from my family's land in a truck with 120 miles of gas in the tank and $40 in my wallet and 1 cracked rib wrapped in athletic tape. I want to be honest about the years that followed because I think the honest version matters more than the version where I tell you I had a plan from day one. I did not have a plan from day one. The first year I survived, it is the most accurate. Word. I ended up in Colorado doing ranch hand work for an operation outside of Pueblo. I slept in a bunkhouse with 5 other men and ate whatever was put in front of me and worked until my body was tired enough that it stopped thinking about Wyoming before I fell asleep. The second year was better. I was promoted to foreman on the Pueblo operation, and I started saving money with the specific intensity of a man who has one purpose. I was not saving for comfort. I was not saving for a fresh start somewhere else. I was saving for the thing I had promised myself on that porch. Somewhere in the 3rd year, I found Ruth. Not romantically. Professionally. Ruth Aguilar was an agricultural law attorney in Denver who had spent 15 years handling exactly the kind of predatory lending cases that Earl Dunbar specialized in. I found her through the attorney in Cheyenne who had looked at my contract. She had sent Ruth to other clients with Earl Dunbar's name on their paperwork. Ruth had a file on Earl that was thick enough to use as a doorstop. She told me on our first call that he was careful, but not perfect. That arrogant men who have done something successfully multiple times always eventually do it one time too. Many without tightening the details, she said. She had been building a case for 3 years, and she needed one more solid piece, and she thought my situation might be it. She said, keep working, keep saving, and give me time. I said, I have been giving this 10 years. She said, I know. Give me a little more. I kept working. I kept saving. Stopped going to bars. I stopped spending money on anything that was not food, rent, and the retainer I paid Ruth every month. Drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it that I fixed myself when it broke, which was often. I became very good at fixing trucks. Became very good at a lot of things during those years because when your life has one direction, everything you learn gets aimed that. It's a direction whether you intend it or not. In year 6, Ruth called me with something. A former employee of Earl's named Gary Pitts had come forward. Gary had worked as Earl's paralegal for 4 years and had left under circumstances that were not amicable. Gary had kept copies of internal communications. emails between Earl and the attorney who drafted his loan contracts, emails that discussed the acceleration clause strategy explicitly, emails that used language like positioned for default and timeline to transfer, and in one particularly useful message, a phrase that Ruth read to me over the phone that I will not repeat in full, but which contained the word deliberately. Earl had not just been predatory, he had documented his predation. Ruth filed a civil fraud complaint in federal court. The basis was a pattern of fraudulent lending practices across multiple counties affecting 6 verified plaintiffs, including me. The filing named Earl personally, and named the holding company, and named 2 of the investors who had purchased the properties from him after the defaults, knowing they were acquired through fraudulent means. I want to tell you about the morning I drove back to Wyoming because it was not what I expected it to feel like. Ruth had called me 2 weeks before to tell me that the court had issued a preliminary injunction freezing URL's assets, including the Wyoming property, pending the outcome of the civil trial. She said I could go back to the land. Not as the owner yet. That would take the trial. But I could go back, and I could see it. I drove up from Colorado on a Tuesday in October. Same month I had left 10 years before. I came over the ridge on the county road just before sunrise the way. I had come home 1,000 times before when I was young, and the land was mine, and I did not yet understand what it meant to lose something. The sky was doing the thing Wyoming skies do in October. Pink and gold and enormous in a way that makes you feel both very small and very located at the same time. Like the sky is telling you exactly where you are. I pulled over on the ridge and I sat in my truck and I looked at the land below. The barn on the northeast corner still standing, the creek line running where it always ran. The south pasture my father built. 412 acres of high plains grass that my grandfather homesteaded in 1951. With a bad knee and a government grant and a stubbornness that I had apparently inherited, I sat there for a long time. Then I drove down. Earl was not there that morning. He was in Denver with his attorney responding to discovery requests. His operation manager, a man named Phil, was there, and Phil looked at me when I got out of my truck with the expression of someone who recognized me but had not expected to see me again. I handed him a copy of the court injunction. He read it. He called Earl. I stood by my truck and waited. Earl called my phone 40 minutes later. His voice had a quality I had not heard in it before. Something that sounded like a man who has been confident for a very long time and has just encountered a thing he does not know how to be confident about. Hank, he said. I said, Earl. He said, this is going to get complicated. I said, I know. I am comfortable with complicated. He said, there are things we could work out between us. I said, I have an attorney. I said, her name is Ruth Aguilar, and I believe you know who she is. A pause, a long one. Then he said, I see. Said, I thought you might. I hung up. The civil trial took 14 months. Will not walk you through every day of it because some of it was genuinely boring in the way that legal processes are boring even when the stakes are enormous. What I will tell you is that Gary Pitts testified for 2 days. What I will tell you is that the email with the word deliberately was entered into evidence on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon, Earl's personal attorney had requested a recess that lasted until the following Monday. What I will tell you is that Earl Dunbar settled before the jury came back. The settlement was not the full number Ruth had asked for. Settlements never are, but it was enough. It included the return of the Wyoming property with clear title in my name. It included financial restitution covering 10 years of lost income calculated by an agricultural economist the court appointed. It included a consent agreement barring Earl from operating as an agricultural lender in the state of Wyoming for 20 years. And it included something Ruth had specifically negotiated that was not about money at all. A formal written acknowledgement signed by Earl Dunbar that the 2014 default was manufactured. That the acceleration clause was used with the deliberate intent to acquire the property at below market value through fraudulent means. His name on a document that said in plain language what he had done. I have that document. I keep it in the same drawer as my grandfather's original homestead grant. I think Walter Collier would appreciate the company. I moved back to the ranch. In the spring, the house needed work. The barn needed a new roof section on the west side. The irrigation system my father built was still mostly functional, but needed one pump replaced. I did all of it myself the way my family has always done. Things on that land. The first morning I woke up in the house, I stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee and looked out at the south pasture in the early light. The grass was coming in, the creek was running, antelope was standing on the far ridge doing what antelope do, which is stand on ridges and look at things. I thought about the cracked rib, thought about the bunkhouse in Pueblo. I thought about 10 years of driving a truck with 200,000 miles on it and fixing it when it broke. And putting every spare dollar into a retainer for a woman in Denver who believed that careful men still made mistakes. I thought about my grandfather coming home from Korea with a bad knee and building something on ground that had no reason to trust him yet. Patient men who believe in the long game. It is a particular kind of inheritance. Earl Dunbar is no longer in the lending business. I do not know what he does now, and I have made a deliberate choice not to spend any energy finding out. Gary Pitts went back to school and is finishing a paralegal certificate in Albuquerque. Ruth Aguilar won a state bar recognition for her work on agricultural predatory lending cases the following year. I sent her a bottle of Wyoming whiskey and a handwritten note that said, "Thank you for believing in the long game," she sent back. A note that said, "Give my regards to the antelope. I run the ranch now the way my father ran it and his father before him. Not perfectly, not profitably every year, but honestly. Every debt is mine. Every decision is mine. Every bad season and every good one. Mine." My grandfather used to say that land does not belong to the person who owns the paper. It belongs to the person who knows how to be still on it. I was still for 10 years, and then I rode back. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. And tell me if you have ever had to choose between reacting fast and waiting for something real. I want to know who is in this with me. Like this video if you believe that patience is a weapon. Subscribe because next week I have a story that is going to hit just as hard as this one. I will see you there.